Well, kia ora, greetings future exercise professionals. My name's Nigel Harris. I'm a lecturer in exercise science here at AUT, and I'll be taking you through this session, which is specifically around exercise prescription for fat loss. So just a brief overview of the session. The key thing is that we focus exclusively on exercise prescription recommendations for fat loss. We don't cover nutrition. So if we just acknowledge first up that nutrition is arguably the most important aspect for fat loss. However, exercise is also very contributive and very important. You're often asked the question, which one is most important? Almost like it's some sort of knockout fight. Put nutrition in one corner and exercise in the other, see which one wins, and that's the only one we're going to focus on, and we'll forget the loser. Well, it's not really like that, because although nutrition is arguably most important, because of the contribution that exercise makes and because they work so well together, it's really important, particularly obviously for exercise professionals, to understand how exercise can contribute to losing fat in a sustainable manner. What this session also assumes is that you are going to be dealing with a client who has come to you, so that's a big step. If they have made the decision to engage in some exercise to lose some fat, then it's certainly a major step forwards right from the start. Obviously, motivating people to do that in the first place is a different ballgame altogether. And just by way of brief review, of course, overweight and obesity are classified typically by body mass index, which you will be well and truly familiar with by now. And there are the classifications. This table is provided to you from Kenny, Wilmore and Costal, a common physiology textbook. And you can see the classifications from underweight to extreme obesity based on body mass index. And there's a little bit of an indication there that of the associated risks of disease as obesity levels increase, which is well and truly known by now. Now, also just by way of background, understand android and gynoid obesity or fat deposition, android being the apple shape, which is more typical in men but certainly not exclusive, and gynoid being the more female body fat deposition pattern. Also setting the scene in our Aotearoa New Zealand context, it's a major problem in our country, our society. We're right up there in international rankings with overweight and obesity, and the New Zealand Health Survey a few years ago identified that. It seems to be a particular problem in our Māori and Pacifica populations. Now, we've made this easy for you to understand why we're all getting so fat, and all you have to do is memorize each one of these boxes and each one of the interconnecting arrows, and then you will have some understanding of the causative factors. Well, of course not, but what you can see here from this, and there's the reference at the top, is that it's not as simple as just saying, well, we're just eating too much and not moving enough. And although that's fundamental, there is an acknowledgement that there are many, many factors that contribute to the scourge of obesity. Here is a simpler model, and what I like about this is you can see that it says there are factors outside the person and inside the person. Now, if you look at some of those factors briefly, you don't have to memorize any of these, it's just by way of background. There's the maternal environment. There are potentially environmental chemicals and toxins, which there's a growing awareness of. Inside the person, we have obviously the genetics. Choose your parents wisely, and their parents, and their parents. And of course, fundamental is increased calorie intake and decreased calorie expenditure. And obviously that's an important aspect, but it's certainly by no means the only reason. And we're all very different. Some people have a predisposition to put fat on, and others don't. Now, in part because of those individual differences, we do see a great deal of individual variation in how people respond to weight loss interventions with exercise. And here's just one example. So this is from a 16-month trial looking to try to decrease body fat in overweight men and women. And we can see here that anything below 0 is weight loss, anything above 0 is weight gain. And you just look at the variation there. In females, a lot of them lost weight, some of them hold steady, and some of them gained weight even over the period, perhaps as a result of compensatory eating. Maybe they weren't doing the exercise as prescribed. It's hard to know. And we see a lot of individual variation in the response amongst the males as well. And although this is a bit of a number bomb, again, not really important at all that you know any of these numbers, but what we can see here is a bunch of studies. They're mostly focused on aerobic exercise, but we look at the range of weight change that occurred over these periods. So it's up to, a year and a half or so. And the range across the individuals within those studies is massive. So the take-home message for exercise professionals here is that everyone responds differently. We're all different, and that's an important acknowledgement to make up front. I'm going to guess that at some stage you've been introduced to the concept of calories in and calories out. And if you have a look at the scales there, basically it means that if you spend more energy than you eat, you will lose weight, and if you put more energy into your mouth than you expend in total, you will gain weight. Calories in, calories out, otherwise known as CICO. And that, of course, is absolutely fundamental to weight loss and weight gain. And you would see in various different places this communicated, and that is that to lose half a kilogram of body fat, you need about a 3,500 calorie deficit. So in some way, whether or not you restrict calories or reduce your calorie intake by 3,500 calories, and or you expend more energy, could be half and half of each, or it might be just one or the other, you will then lose weight. And that's the calories in, calories out model of weight loss. Simply burn more calories than you put into your mouth, and you will lose body fat. So how do you spend energy? Well, it isn't just exercise, of course. Fundamentally, the most energy taxing, or the highest cost of energy, is the energy cost of living. So that's your resting or your basal metabolic rate. We can see in this case it's somewhere between 60 and 75% of the total calories that you expend across a day, a week, a year. There is also a certain caloric cost of digesting food. That's not the topic of today. We know different foods have a slightly different caloric cost of digestion. But then, of course, what we're interested in is the caloric cost, or the energy cost, of activity and exercise. And what I would really like to draw your attention to are these interlinking arrows, in particular this one here. And so what this is saying is, of course, that the activity and exercise which you perform has a direct influence on your basal metabolic rate, and that's an important part of it. So out of interest, there are equations that you can use in order to estimate your basal metabolic rate, your resting metabolic rate. There are lots of different equations. Here's one of the more common ones that you see out there, the Harris-Benedict equation. There are the formulas at the top. You need three things. You need to know what your weight is, you need to know what your height is in centimetres, and your age, and of course your gender. You then do those calculations and multiply it by one of these factors according to how active you think you are, and that will give you an estimate of the total number of calories that you need in order to simply maintain current body weight and survive. And so that's not at all uncommon to see in practice. Practitioners across nutrition and exercise will do that, calculate the number of calories they think their clients should be eating, and then work out how much they can expend or subtract through nutrition and or exercise, and estimate the number of the amount that they're going to lose weight and how long that's going to take. So if we go back to that standard calories in, calories out model, and the fact that theoretically you need to have a 3,500 calorie deficit to lose half a kilogram of body fat, or about a pound. Is it that simple? Well, probably not. Just to let you know, that has been challenged. You can read that little abstract there if you want to. There is a reference for a website to give you an online calculator if you want to estimate the type of weight loss that can be expected. But basically what it says is two things. Number one is that you probably need to have a greater than 3,500 calorie deficit to lose about half a kilogram. And number two, it isn't linear. You don't just keep losing weight at the same rate. It probably looks more like this. So here's an example of that online calculator. You tend to lose weight more rapidly at the start, and then it tapers off as you progress. And intuitively, you'd know that to be the case. Now, you don't need to use this calculator. It's just there for your interest, and it's also there to draw your attention to the fact that although the fundamental rule is that in order for your body to burn or utilize about half a kilogram of body fat, to lose that fat, you need about a 3,500 calorie deficit. That's a general rule, and it isn't exact, and it doesn't apply to everyone in exactly the same way. Right, so how do we do that? By burning calories. Let's have a look at the caloric or calorie expenditure side of the equation. I think this is a great summary for how to approach it in general. And what you'll notice at the base of this pyramid, in other words, fundamentally the most important things, are more general movement. Now you might find that boring as an exercise professional, that you are doing a lecture on how to write exercise programs to get people to lose body fat, and the first thing that you're told about how to do that is to get people more active in general. However, it is an absolutely critical message. So what we can see here in this particular model, which I think represents it well, is that some structured and particularly more vigorous activity can really peak the pyramid and top things up nicely, but fundamental to anyone losing weight for a longer period of time and in a sustainable manner is a greater base of general activity. And so that might simply start with thinking of movement as an opportunity, not an inconvenience. So rather than, for example, taking the lift, the elevator up one flight of stairs, or stopping walking on those moving elevators, you continue to move. You might park a bit further away. All of those messages you've probably heard a little bit more before. Certainly sit less, a lot less. All of the movement that you perform across a day, a week, a month, a year goes in the energy bank. Hey, let's have a look at an interesting little study here. So the details don't all matter, but what this study did was put people in chambers where they could measure how much energy they were spending across a period of time, and just calculated that all across 24 hours on 177 different people. Let's have a look at the bottom line here. A large portion of the variability of the 24-hour EE, that's energy expenditure among individuals, was due to the variability in the degree of spontaneous physical activity, including fidgeting, which accounted for 100 to 800 calories a day in these subjects, not just the fidgeting, but the general physical activity. Now that's a lot of calories, and would take quite a bit of effort to burn off that total number of calories during exercise. Certainly possible, and I'll talk about how very shortly. But you can see that general physical activity is a very, very important part of fat loss through movement and exercise. So plenty of physical activity appears to be a fundamental aspect of weight loss through activity and exercise, and that's reflected in position statements such as this one by the American College of Sports Medicine, the ACSM. So just a reminder of what position stands or position statements are. It's a bunch of research or a bunch of experts that are brought together by a credible organisation, and they review all the research in an area and come up with a summary or try to make sense of it. And this one was published in 2009. It's probably due for an update soon. But what they said was it builds on previous work that says, look, plenty of physical activity, and what they've described as moderate intensity physical activity, appears to be an important aspect for weight loss and prevention of weight regain. So they talk about minimum of 150 to 250 minutes a week in total, but over 250 minutes a week being more effective. Now that's reflected in our own ministry's guidelines for weight management in New Zealand adults. Again, what you see here is moderate intensity aerobic physical activity, and they give an example here, brisk walking, on most or all days of the week, and that's up to a total of about 150 minutes a week. But what they then say is that for extra health benefits and probably better weight loss, more is better. The National Weight Loss Registry is based in America, and it is essentially a self-report repository where many, many thousands of people have been able to report how they lost weight and kept it off. Now there's a bunch of information in there, and there's a website if you want to go through all the way through it. But in terms of activity and exercise, a couple of key themes. 94% of people that lost weight and kept it off increased their physical activity, and walking was the most common thing. And then 90% say they exercise on average about 1 hour a day. So look, here's the summary from that. Lots of moderate intensity aerobic style work such as walking does work for weight loss. There doesn't seem to be any doubt about that. So sometimes that delineation between physical activity in general and exercise gets a little bit confused, and I think it probably does a wee bit with those public health recommendations on just being physically active. Now, we've seen that moderate intensity aerobic exercise works. We also know that non-exercise activity thermogenesis, so anything that you do outside of structured exercise, is really, really important as a component of total calorie expenditure across time. So all general movement is most certainly to be encouraged, and that's a critical part of any exercise professional's job, is to make sure that people are doing that outside of the exercise setting. If you just come to an exercise setting and do a hard exercise session and spend the rest of your time sitting down, it's far less likely to have a long-lasting significant effect on fat loss. But if the person is also then involved in general activity, in addition to that structured exercise, then you've probably got a much better recipe. And so what we'll do now is look specifically at this part of the package. How is it that you can deliver more structured exercise as an exercise professional to really augment fat loss in addition to the non-exercise activity thermogenesis? And we'll look beyond just recommending that people do a lot of moderate intensity aerobic exercise. We want other options that add a bit more value to a session and arguably have a slightly more potent effect in the time that we've got with our clients. And the first one is HIIT, high intensity interval training. Just by way of background, interval training has been around for a long time, but it really started to reach headlines around 2006. It's not when it first started, but there were some studies done in Canada with 30-second bursts of exercise by a group led by a guy called Martin Gibala, and they found some really good results across fitness and fat loss, and it started to hit the media, and they were calling it the 3-minute workout. And that group, or that author, has actually just published a book called The 1-Minute Workout. And as an indicator recently, how mainstream it's become, if you look at this worldwide survey of fitness trends done by the American College of Sports Medicine and published in their Health and Fitness Journal, for the last 4 years HIIT has been right up there, number 1, 2, 3 and 3. So it's certainly very, very topical. Now we'll examine that specifically now in terms of how it works for fat loss. Just in case you're wondering exactly what HIIT is, I think everyone's heard of it. I don't know that it's fully understood. Here are a few examples, and this is just a graphic representation to make it a little bit simpler to get an overview for how HIIT works. There are many different versions of it. Now what you're looking at here is that anything that's green represents the work interval. So that's where you're doing the actual exercise. And the red is the rest or recovery phase, which doesn't always mean you're doing nothing, but that's where you back off and have the lower intensity sort of recovery bits. And here's just a representation from 0 to approximately 20 minutes. So traditional steady state exercise, of course, you just go non-stop. That's SSE, steady state exercise, and you just continue, you don't stop at a moderate intensity, low to moderate intensity typically. So the different types of HIIT that are most common, Tabata is one of the more famous ones, originally came out in 1996. 20 seconds of very, very heavy effort, followed by 10 seconds of recovery, and you do that 8 times. The whole workout's about 4 minutes long. Very, very short and sharp. This was the one that hit the headlines around 2006. I've called it Gibala after the lead researcher. 30 seconds of really, really, really hard exercise, gut-wrenchingly hard, followed by 4 minutes of very light recovery, and then you repeat that 4 to 6 times in total. So although you're only doing sort of 2 to 3 minutes of actual really hard work, the whole session can take 20 to 30 minutes. One-to-one's a really common model. That's where you do 1 minute of hard exercise. It's typically at least 90% of your heart rate maximum, or 95% up to 100% depending on which author it is, followed by 1 minute of recovery, and then you repeat that. Minute on, minute off, minute on, minute off, and usually do that up to about 10 times for a total of 20 minutes, excluding the warm-up. And then there are longer intervals, so for example this one here, which is particularly popular in the Scandinavian countries, or the researchers there anyway, 4 minutes of hard but not really hard exercise. It's typically around that 90% of heart rate maximum, so below this intensity but still hard, followed by 2 to 4 minutes of rest, and you normally repeat that up to 4 times, so the whole workout still takes quite a long time, relatively speaking. And then there are other models. There are all sorts of different ones, but there's an example of where you just put little bursts in. So in this example here, it's from an Australian group. You go 8 seconds of burst and 12-second recovery, and you just do that over and over again for up to 20 minutes. And these aren't the only examples of HIIT, but you can see there's actually quite a spectrum of differences. And although HIIT research started on bikes and treadmills, most commonly exercycles in a laboratory, it has morphed or adapted to be used in a variety of different settings now. So for example, you often see HIIT done with press-ups and burpees. Most people, when they think Tabatas, think press-ups, burpees and star jumps and tuck jumps and what have you. In fact, originally Tabata was done on an exercycle, but it got morphed into that type of exercise. So, in summary, HIIT, in case you didn't know already, involves very short bursts between a few seconds up to a few minutes of very hard exercise at varying degrees, followed by a period of recovery, and then you repeat that a few times over, depending on which protocol you're following. So can HIIT contribute to fat loss? Well, yes, it sure can. It's actually a really good exercise option because it is so time efficient, and particularly as an instructor or a personal trainer, if you're wanting to really add value to a session, so when someone comes to you, you want to achieve maximum benefit and give them something they wouldn't necessarily do on their own or can't do on their own, HIIT sessions are a really good option. Now here's an overview from a 2011 review. That's just the name of the authors down here. But what you're looking at is the results that they got from doing this particular type of HIIT. So they've called this high intensity intermittent exercise here, which is HIIT. So, for example, 60 times 8 seconds on and 12 seconds recovery. 15 seconds on, 15 seconds recovery, 4 minutes on, 4 minutes recovery, etc. Where you see SSE, that means steady state exercise. So in this particular example, they're cruising along doing a steady state, moderate intensity exercise, and then they do 5 bursts of 2 to 3 minutes, I think. What's this one? 10 lots of 4 minutes on and 2 minutes off. 60 lots, that's again 15 times 30 seconds. So there's a whole variety of them, and there's been a lot of research that's been done since 2011. But what we then look at over on the left-hand side is what happens as a result of training that way over a period of time, so between sort of 6 or 2 and 12 weeks. Subcutaneous fat, that is the fat just underneath your skin, subcutaneous, abdominal trunk fat, total body mass and waist circumference. And of course up arrow means it increased and the down arrow means that it decreased. And there's the percentage that it decreased. Now we look across the board here, we're seeing decreases, in many cases quite substantive, in all of these parameters. And so what we can summarize from that is that yes, HIIT is a really good way to lose body fat. It isn't the only way. That's not necessarily a panacea, a silver bullet. It also doesn't mean that you shouldn't do aerobic exercise at moderate intensity. What it does mean is that you can deliver HIIT with your clients, to your clients, and get some really good results in a relatively short time frame. It's really important to acknowledge though that it's not a one-way traffic. So although we've presented some information to show that HIIT can be really effective on fat loss and a great exercise option, not all studies show that it works as well as other types of exercise. And here's just one example for you, just to balance the books a wee bit. Here's a study that compared the effect of HIIT versus continual aerobic exercise. So that's CONT versus HIIT, and there was a placebo group as well. And they were measured for body fat on DEXA, which is a really good way to measure it. Now, what did they find? There was a significant effect on percent trunk fat for continuous. They lost 3.1%, and even the placebo lost body fat, but not in the HIIT. They actually increased it a little bit for whatever reason. Perhaps they started eating more, compensatory eating. There was a reduction in android fat percentage, so that's that fat around the middle in continuous, 2.7%, and placebo, but not in HIIT, where they got an increase of 0.8%. Again, you wonder why. Perhaps they had compensatory eating as a result of exercising hard. So their conclusion, the data suggests that HIIT, although it works really well and time efficient for fitness benefits, didn't work in inactive, overweight adults, as well as continuous exercise training for fat loss. Now, while it might be frustrating for you to be told at first that HIIT works, but then secondly told that it might not work, it's really important to understand that's the case. There is no a magic bullet, there's no one way to do things, but HIIT does represent a really good option. That's if people can and will do it. Adherence is another thing. That's where personal training and exercise instruction can really come into its own. Most people find it really hard to exercise at the appropriate intensity on their own, and so that's where having someone deliver the session to them and give them that intensity, that motivation and that understanding is a really good thing, and that's where HIIT can work particularly well, and where in particular personal training can add a great deal of value. So yes, HIIT can work, but it doesn't always. Now, an interesting question arises from that. You may or may not have heard of the fat burning zone. I'm guessing you probably have. It's pretty common. And it seems to be counterintuitive to think that something as intense as HIIT is effective at burning fat, when you may have been told that in order to burn fat you need to be in the fat burning zone. Now, although it's getting a little bit old-fashioned, it still seems to be out there. There's an impression, it's even in, I've seen it on some treadmills and bikes and posters and whatnot in exercise facilities in some cases, and that is that in order to burn fat, you need to be exercising at a low to moderate intensity. So here's a bit of an old-fashioned poster, but it's still an example of it. What this is saying is that if you want to increase performance and improve fitness, exercise at high intensity. So for example, for a 30-year-old, what they're suggesting is that you want to be somewhere around 140 to 200 beats a minute. But what they're saying for that same 30-year-old for weight management in this yellow zone, make sure that you're only somewhere between 115-ish up to about 130-ish in this zone, the weight management zone, the fat burning zone. And so what this is directly telling you is that if you exercise too hard, you are not going to be in the optimum fat burning zone. Now, let's just clarify this. It is physiologically very, very true that you only burn fat as a fuel source at lower to moderate intensity exercise. So, around 65-ish% of your maximum capacity. Above that point, you are incrementally starting to burn during exercise more carbohydrate as a fuel source and less fat, to the point where your body cannot utilize that fat as a fuel source at very high intensity. There's no doubting that. There is no dispute. At very high intensity exercise, you cannot burn fat as the fuel. It simply doesn't happen fast enough. It's slower burning. So that gave rise to this fat burning zone, whereby, well, if we want to lose body fat, we need to work to utilize as much body fat as possible during the exercise sessions in order for it to be successful, the fat burning zone, the weight management zone. Now, what that doesn't account for, of course, is a couple of things. One is fundamental, that it doesn't account for the total number of calories that you are expending in an exercise session. And here's just some theoretical examples. It does depend on the size of the person, etc. But if you were to look down the right-hand side here, if I get rid of that for a moment, you'd look at these four mystery activities from 1 to 4 down here and say, righto, well, this one here is burning 90% carbohydrate, that's the CHO, carbohydrate, and that's percent body fat. Well, this one's burning 90% carbohydrate and 10% fat during the exercise. That's no good, we don't want that. Whereas we look at this exercise here, and that's burning 80% fat and 20% carbohydrate, so clearly this would be your choice for body fat loss. And then you start to add to that picture a little bit, and you go, well, let's consider the total number of calories per hour these 4 activities, which you've already got in front of you, take, and then calculate the percentage or the total calories carbohydrate and total calories fat. Well, so two key things become important. Number one is the total calorie expenditure is important because calories matter a great deal. There we can see an example of those sessions. But also what matters is what happens after the session. The excess or enhanced post-exercise oxygen consumption, the EPOC. There it is there. Excess or enhanced post-exercise oxygen consumption. And you would have seen this theory before, but what it means is that once you stop exercising, you continue to utilize oxygen and therefore calories as a fuel source for a period after the exercise, and that period is known as EPOC. And exercise intensity is an important part of that. In other words, the calories which you continue to burn when the session has finished do actually matter. Some people call that the afterburn, and there's a list of some of the contributive factors to that. So although the total number of calories that you burn during the session is most important, what happens after the session is also important, not just in terms of calories, but other physiological processes which stimulate fat burning. And the more intense exercise is particularly good at that. So where you're doing particularly that sort of more anaerobic style of exercise and producing that lactic acid, that lactate, and other things like human growth hormone, you are stimulating fat burning. So in other words, at higher intensity exercise, although you don't burn a lot of fat at all as a fuel source during the actual session, you do hook into fat stores significantly once the exercise has finished. Here's just one example of this. What this study did compared the energy expenditure for 24 hours post 2 different sessions. One of them was HIIT. It was 10 lots of 1 minute on and 1 minute off. So the 1 minute on was at 90% of your heart rate maximum, so that's hard but not super hard, with 1 minute of light recovery. And E&D is endurance. That was cycling at 70% of heart rate maximum for 50 minutes in total. So that's a total of 20 minutes versus a total of 50 minutes. And they measured energy expenditure. Well, what they found was that they were both very, very similar post 20 minutes. And so while both of those sessions had a significant impact on caloric expenditure for 24 hours after the session had finished, there was no difference between HIIT and endurance, and so that 20 minutes had quite a profound effect on the energy expenditure for 24 hours after the session. Now, although this particular study didn't measure it, it is known that after intense exercise you do start to hook into fat stores, and so that becomes an important after effect of more intense exercise such as HIIT. So to wrap HIIT up for now, does it work for fat loss? Yes, it does. Not always, but it has been shown to be an effective option for fat loss across a variety of different individuals in a variety of different ways. You've seen different examples of doing HIIT, and in many cases it seems to work better than the steady state exercise. Does it enhance your EPOC and your resting metabolic rate? Yes, it does. And in some cases at least as equal to much higher duration aerobic exercise, and we know that it improves performance, VO2 max, etc., VO2 max. The key question around HIIT is that it'll only work if you can and will do it. Funny thing is that if you don't do HIIT, it doesn't work. And again, that is where yourselves as exercise professionals, prescribing, delivering, monitoring and supervising and motivating can make quite a bit of difference, so you can have a lot of impact in a relatively short period of time for your clients for fat loss. Okay, so the question is, how do you actually put that in the program? There's a couple of important points. One is, look, don't do HIIT too often. Don't be thinking that you need to do very high frequency of HIIT for it to work. Inevitably that will lead to some sort of overtraining and or lack of adherence, because it's hard if you do it properly. As a guideline, probably 1 to 3 times a week, depending on other activities. Now, if your clients are doing a lot of just general light activity, and I'm not talking about moderate intensity aerobic, I'm just talking about being generally active in their life, it's a really good thing to top it up with a little bit of HIIT, particularly if they've indicated that they're enjoying it once they get used to it. Now, if you're dealing with a client who is particularly stressed in a chronic situation, sometimes HIIT is not a good thing up front. You just want to get them a little bit fitter first before you hit them with something really hard and stressful like this. It can actually sometimes backfire. So if you're dealing with a chronic stressed individual, just gently get them fit first and gradually introduce HIIT. The second thing is, don't forget the second I in HIIT. It's interval or intermittent. Some people see HI, high intensity, and just think they've got to go absolutely hard out the whole time with very little break, otherwise they're not doing anything. And that is not the case. The whole concept of HIIT is that you do a short sharp burst from anywhere from a few seconds to a few minutes, And then you have a period of recovery from a few seconds to a few minutes, and you put that together like a recipe. Don't think that you have to go hard out the whole time. If you do that, you have to back off the intensity, and that's not the point. Now the final point is, how do you introduce it gradually? Well, you don't have to go from doing moderate intensity steady state exercise to exclusively HIIT. So for example, if you've got someone who's got to the point where they can walk or jog for 20 or 30 minutes, you're not going to say, righto, from now on we're only going to do HIIT, and today, boom, Tabata, that's it, let's go. You might say, well, instead of your 20 to 30 walk or jog this today, or bike or whatever it is, we'll just introduce a couple of sets of higher intensity work, and we're just going to see how you like that, how you feel about it, get you used to it. So we'll cruise along on the bike or jog or whatever it is you're doing, and then boom, you might say, for example, let's go 1 minute, go really hard out. I want you to sprint, I want you to go to that lamppost, I want you to crank up the level on the bike, whatever it is you're doing. Okay, now let's back off for a minute. Let's do that one more time. Go hard for a minute, now back off for a minute. Okay, now let's go back to your cruisy session. So it's only 2 lots of 1 minute on, 1 minute off, or a couple of lots of 20 to 30 seconds, whatever it is you're doing. Just gradually introduce it rather than going exclusively from people that are used to low to moderate intensity work up to very high intensity HIIT type sessions. Inevitably what that will do is, well, probably put them off. You might injure them. If you don't injure them, you might put them off that level of intensity. It normally takes a bit of getting used to, and you don't have to go exclusively from one to the other. So be sensible about how you introduce it. You could periodize it a little bit over a period of time. You don't have to go directly to a full HIIT protocol. Just introduce a little element of it in your programming. Now, inevitably what happens in that case is people get used to it, they get fitter, they get accustomed to being really puffed in short, sharp bursts, and actually what can happen is they start to like it because it can release that catecholamine, that endorphin, adrenaline effect, and give them a bit of an exercise buzz. And they get really fit from it too, so that adds to the effect. Just be careful about how you introduce it. Do it sensibly, not all in one go. So turning attention now to resistance training, weight training, strength training. We know what that does for you, but let's look at it specifically in terms of losing body fat. First of all, a few alarming statistics, all based on plenty of research. After the age of around 30, or arguably a little bit younger these days given our inactivity levels, if you gained up to around half a kilogram of fat per year, which is certainly not uncommon, and lost a couple of 100 grams or 0.2 of a kilogram of muscle per year after the age of around 30, between the ages of 30 and 50 you would put on 4 to 10 kilograms of fat and simultaneously lose 2 to 4 kilograms of muscle. And that of course is a major issue for a number of reasons, but very, very common. And there are some more stats down there to show you that from this particular article. Average adult gains half a kilogram of fat and simultaneously loses around a quarter of a kilogram of muscle every year between the ages of 30 and 60. So that's not pretty reading. There it is graphically from Stu Phillips's research group, Muscle in black, and we see that go down over the decades, and grey body fat, and we see that go up over the decades. And so those two are very much connected, and of course, as you probably already know, that's where resistance training can already play a major part. Now, having said that, we go back to the position statement from the ACSM, and it's a rather curious one, I think. It says resistance training doesn't enhance weight loss, but may increase fat-free mass and increase loss of fat mass. So what they're saying is that although the scales don't change, it does actually help you to lose body fat, although it does help you with a bunch of other things. So sometimes resistance training gets a bit of a bad rap in terms of whether or not it helps you lose weight or not. Here's a really good article if you do want to read more about it. If you've got a specific interest, we've put it online for you. Just to get this straight, you don't need to read this. There's nothing sort of examinable about it apart from what's on this chart, which I'll give you at the end. And it's a really nice title, Lift Weights to Fight Overweight, by Antonio Paoli and others. And you can see in the little diagram version here, it says, well, how could resistance training contribute? We already kind of know that it enhances muscle mass. You would have known that already. But it does a bunch of other things. It can improve your NEAT because you get stronger and feel more functional. So those two things are connected. Resistance training regularly helps to improve, theoretically, your level of non-exercise activity thermogenesis. It increases the energy-demanding fat-free mass. So it's well known that muscle is metabolically active. If you can at least keep your naturally given muscle mass, you're more likely to have a better enhanced metabolic rate, given the energy demand of that particular tissue. It is not necessarily as appetite stimulating as aerobic exercises, some people would argue. And there's contradictory research on that, but it can be the case. And it does increase what's known as lipolytic hormones. So that is growth hormone, that's GH, cortisol, which chronically elevated it is not a good thing, but short term helps to burn body fat, and decrease insulin, which we know is a good thing as well. It's considered a bit of a master hormone for fat deposition. And it increases the production of fat metabolism related cytokines. Now there's a whole bunch of those and they get really complex, but essentially what happens when you contract your muscle against and have to exert force with it, you produce these cytokines which have an effect on how much fat you then burn. So it has a very positive fat burning effect, even if it's not just about the calories you burn. And partly because of that, it enhances your EPOC, your enhanced post-exercise oxygen consumption. So look, lifting weights isn't just about adding muscle mass, although that's what everyone tends to think it's all about. So another aspect of resistance training with weight loss is that it helps preserve that precious muscle mass. It is known that, particularly with rapid weight loss, and when there is dietary or calorie restriction, particularly if people press that a little bit too hard, you do lose weight, of course, but what you can lose is, in addition to body fat, is the valuable muscle mass, which we don't want to lose, we want to keep. And so it's interesting to have a look at how resistance training can affect that, even with quite severe caloric restriction. Now this is an eye full of information here, numbers everywhere, words everywhere. I'll talk through it. It's once again, the idea is not that you take on board all of these numbers, it doesn't matter, it's just the key message. So let me just explain what you're looking at here. This is a study that looked at resistance training versus aerobic exercise. So there were two groups here. One group did 3 times a week, a bunch of exercises, there is the loading. They did weight training. And the other group did 4 times a week, aerobic exercise, 20 to 50 minutes at around 78% heart rate max. Now interestingly here, both of them were on a very low calorie diet. 800 calories a day liquid diet, not a lot of fun. Same macronutrient composition. You can imagine what an 800 calorie a day liquid diet is, ingested 5 times a day. Not a lot of calories and it's not a lot of fun, so quite a hard knockback on caloric intake. Normally people are sort of between 1,500 and 3,000 calories depending on how active they are and how big they are. Now what they did was investigated pre and post, and they looked at their body weights, their body fat percentage, their lean muscle mass, that's what LMM is, their resting metabolic rate and their fitness levels. Now both groups lost a lot of weight, as you would probably expect. Over 12 weeks it was in total. So the resistance training group lost about 15% of their body weight, and the aerobic exercise group lost 19% of their body weight. Now the reading gets more interesting because when you look at the body fat percentage, it was measured by underwater weighing, which is considered a good technique. The resistance training group lost 18.6% body fat versus the control group, that's the aerobic exercise group, that lost about 17%. The lean muscle mass, the resistance training guys lost just a little bit, 1.6%. The aerobic training group, remember exactly the same diet, they lost 8% of lean muscle mass. The resting metabolic rate in the resistance training group dropped just a little bit, even on 800 calories a day. The resting metabolic rate in the aerobic exercise group dropped 13%. So some fairly profound figures there. By the way, VO2 also went up in the resistance training group. So don't forget VO2 is for cardiovascular system as well if it's performed correctly, not just for neuromuscular. Okay, so what we see here, and that's the graphic version of it too if you prefer the graphs, it's the same information but visually. What we see here is that on exactly the same nutritional intake, resistance training really prevented a great deal of muscle mass loss. and helped preserve a great deal of resting metabolic rate too. So it had a really sort of protective effect even on extreme calorie restriction. Now folks, just while we're on the topic of weight training, I just want to very briefly cover spot reduction. I'm pretty sure that most people know this now, but just to confirm, there's still sort of a common opinion amongst the public that if you work hard on a particular area, it will help you lose fat in that area. And I suppose what happens is people feel the muscle working, they might get some muscle soreness out of it, perhaps they see some muscle definition occurring, and assume that the fat has been stripped from that area as a result of working that area. Now, I suppose the classic scenario is the old sit-ups, or doing heaps of tricep pushdowns, thinking that you're going to burn fat off the Mexican waves or something. But look, it's not true. You can't burn fat from a localized area through exercising that area specifically. Obviously, you can work on the muscular development, and that can improve the look and the tone or the firmness of the area. But whatever exercise you're doing, when you lose fat stores, you draw on all fat stores generally. And although certain areas will come off before others, usually the areas that we want to lose the most are the last ones to come from, you don't target fat reduction in a specific area by working that area with resistance training. It does not work like that, unfortunately. It would be nice if it did. But spot reduction's a myth, and so it's important that if you get a client that thinks that, you just put that straight. Work on the area, make it better, and strengthen it and all those other things, but you're not burning fat off that area by working it. Alright, let's try and bring this together in form of some sort of summary. Look, the first thing is that it's really important that people move in general. If they don't have non-exercise activity thermogenesis going on, if they're sedentary for most of the time, whatever exercise you prescribe is going to have far less effect. So part of what you can do for them is to encourage that and counsel that. The next thing is that, look, any exercise will help with weight loss. And so really it's a matter of finding something that someone can and will do, and that becomes the art form of exercise instruction versus just the science. The key thing is it's done with some sort of consistency, and it will contribute meaningfully to weight loss and of course a variety of other health outcomes, as we know with exercise, not just fat loss. It's known that the sort of higher volume of steady state exercise, that moderate aerobic exercise such as brisk walking, is effective for long-term fat loss. Whether or not everyone is going to do that is another question and can fit it in, but if that's an option that works, it's certainly well worth pursuing. That doesn't necessarily mean it's the only thing that should be done. HIIT does work for fat loss. It's a matter of introducing it sensibly, making judicious choices around how you introduce it into a program. There are a variety of different options that work, so try them out, introduce them incrementally, and see if people get to like it, because for some people that intensity might be a bit of a shock, so you do need to be careful about that. However, a lot of people like the time efficiency, they like the feeling it gives them, and it can give very good results because we know that the physiological responses from HIIT sessions have a really good effect on general fat loss, and it isn't just about calorie burning. Likewise with resistance training, it isn't just about how many calories you're burning. It has a potent effect on the physiological processes which occur after a resistance training session in the recovery periods, including an enhancement of the fat burning processes that occur in the body. We also know, of course, you probably don't need to be told anymore that it enhances muscle mass, and that's a good thing for most people, particularly given the inactivity that people tend to unfortunately get into. So HIIT and RT add value to things like personal training sessions. The final thing is that, look, it's individual. You'd really like to have a lecture like this and simply be told, here's how you do it. Just do it this way because this is the best way and it works for everyone, and so go ahead. Well, it's just not that way, unfortunately. It'd be nice if it was. Different people respond to different things. Part of that's physiological, part of it's psychological, part of it's just who they are, and you might need to change your plans as needed. Some people will respond to a certain type of training, some people will like things, some people will not like things, and that's an important part of it. So monitor your success, get feedback, introduce things sensibly, and see how it goes. But try to get someone into a consistent habit, and your supervision, your motivation, your structure as an exercise professional is a really, really important part of that. Thanks for listening. Just to wrap things up, I've put 8 questions by way of review for you to see if you can answer. Here are the first 4 and the second 4. So go ahead and see how you go with those. All the best for the rest of your course.